And so we come to 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. Now, Paul uses both in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 and then later in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 what we might call a sandwich method, or an intercalation might be its more technical IBS term. A sandwich is basically where you start a topic and then you finish a topic later, and in the middle there's this meat, this part of the sandwich. Mark does this, by the way, with relation to the fig tree. Jesus curses the fig tree, he goes and he throws the money changers out of the temple, and then we come out and we find the fig trees withered. So you have a beginning of a story and an end of a story separated by this other story. The intercalation or sandwich in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, he begins the topic of food that's been sacrificed to idols in chapter 8, and he finishes that topic in chapter 10. But then in chapter 9, he talks about something that may at first seem like a different topic, but as it turns out, chapter 9 is meant to help us understand what he's saying in chapters 8 and 10. He does the same thing on spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. He starts the discussion of spiritual gifts in chapter 12 and finishes it in chapter 14, and in the middle is the love chapter. And the love chapter is actually the key to solving the Corinthians' problems on spiritual gifts. In fact, the love chapter is the key to solving all the Corinthians' problems of disunity. So, 8 through 10 of 1 Corinthians. Chapter 8 raises this question of meat that's been sacrificed to idols, and then chapter 10 finishes that topic. And in the middle, he talks about what he has done himself as an apostle. He uses himself as an example of what the Corinthians should do with regard to this topic. So, chapter 8 begins now concerning food sacrificed to idols. Some translations might say concerning meat sacrificed to idols. It's concerning things sacrificed to idols, but I do think meat is the primary culprit in this discussion. The now concerning suggests that this is one of the issues that they wrote him about, one of the questions that they had. And we can see the quotation marks. We all know, we have knowledge. Yes, we do. We have knowledge. How about you? They think, we got knowledge over here. You can see some other things. Verse 4, an idol doesn't really exist. There is no God but one. That's the Shema there, quoting the Old Testament. You can hear someone making an accumulative case. I'm guessing a follower of Apollos, one of those smart, wise guys that are part of the Apollos party, is saying, look, there's no idol at the temple of Isis. Well, there's no temple of Isis in Greece. At the temple of Aphrodite. There's no idol at the temple of Asclepius. I mean, there's no God there. An idol's nothing. I'm smart. I know that Zeus doesn't exist. The Greeks are stupid. Can I help it if the Greeks are stupid and think there actually is a Demeter or whoever? And so there's no God but one. Idols don't exist. I have this knowledge. And so you can hear someone saying, and therefore, I have no problem going to eat at a pagan temple. I'm not violating monotheism when I go to the temple of Asclepius. They're stupid. Is it my fault they're stupid? This is you can hear the argument that someone from the Apollos group would be saying. Paul doesn't want to contradict them. Paul doesn't want to claim that an idol is something, obviously. And so, what is he going to do? He's inspired, of course, and he had natural intelligence. He does I think he makes a great argument here. In the end, he'll argue, when we get to chapter 10, in the end, he'll argue, that's a place of a temple, that's a pagan god living there. Why would I want to go eat, or that's a demon, is what he ends up saying. He ends up saying, demons live at those temples. Why would I want to go to the house of a demon? And so he says, yes, it's true that there's only one God, and that these other gods don't really exist, at least not as gods. And therefore, you're right, but they are the house of demons. There's a demon of Asclepius. I didn't grow up thinking of the pagan gods like that. I thought, oh, how fun. Zeus, Hera, what a fun story. We all know that those stupid Greeks, these aren't real people. I kind of grew up going through high school thinking that way. Paul does give a different perspective. From Paul's perspective, pagan temples are demon-possessed. Demons inhabit them. They're not true gods. And so this actually gives us a helpful perspective, I think, on the Old Testament. What do we do with Baal? What do we do with Dagon? What do we do with the gods of the Canaanites? because we don't believe in gods, and yet Exodus says you will have no other gods before me, which sounds like these other entities exist. Well, I think from one way to process this from a Christian perspective is to think of the gods of the other nations in the Old Testament as being demonic powers. And that when the command says you'll have no other gods before me, and sounds very henotheistic. Henotheism is there's only one legitimate God, even though other gods exist. I think the way I would process that as a Christian is to say, yes, there were other spiritual powers, but there's only one good God, and the only legitimate God is the Creator God. And so Paul acknowledges them. He doesn't just smack them. He says, yes, you do have some knowledge here, Mr. Converted by Apollos. Yes, an idol isn't anything in the world. And of course, the Shema. There's no God but one. You're right. Yet for us, verse 6 is a very important verse in terms of the biblical Christology and theology. For us, there's one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and there's one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. Very important Christological statement. In terms of the history of the early church, this is the earliest really important verse on theology and Christology. Some think Paul may be even quoting something here because he's gone a little poetic. Who knows? Maybe he is, or maybe he composed it on the spot. But there is this sense that of the early development of early Christian confessions, development of early Christian creeds and things that they said. And here, this is an affirmation of one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus Christ. God the Father is the source of all things. He's the one from whom all things exist. He is the ultimate of the universe. And then there's the Lord, who is the agent or the instrument of creation, maybe. And there's debate about whether Paul is being literal here, that Jesus was the actual artificer, as it were, of creation, or whether this is intrinsically comparing Jesus to God's wisdom. Proverbs 9 and other Jewish texts talk about how God created the world through his wisdom and through his word. And so some wonder if this is the first instance of a kind of logos speculation within early Christianity, where Jesus is being compared to the wisdom God used in creating the world, or the word that God spoke in creating the world. Well, very little to go on here to be able to answer that question. So probably what answer we come to will depend on other texts that we've read. So Paul, basically, let me tell you where Paul ends up on this. Paul is both, he's a mixture of practical and pragmatic and of basic principles. And so he basically says, okay, well, let me tell you the situation, if you don't know it. The situation is that there was a lot of sacrifice in the ancient world. They sacrificed all the time, everywhere, to all kinds of deities. And a lot of animals died in the ancient world. Let's just be honest. There was a lot of death of animals in the ancient world as sacrifices were made to the gods. Now, these were not whole burnt offerings. I used to think that a sacrifice was basically, the whole thing's gone. The Jews did have a whole burnt offering, but it was only one of their offerings, and that was highly unusual in the ancient world. Most of the time, in a sacrifice, the fat goes to the god, and then the meat goes to the people. Actually, it's a good deal. Especially if you don't like to eat fat. Well, sure, give the god the fat. Silly god likes fat. I think most non-American cultures and European cultures, I do not have exhaustive or extensive experience, but what little experience I have suggests that other cultures actually like the fat. That the fat is much more delightful in other places than it is for us here in the United States. If you're watching in the United States. If you're not watching in the United States, hi. But anyway, so the fat was given to the god, and then the meat was distributed to the priests. So the priests, how did the priests eat? Well, the priests got to eat sumptuously from the meat of things sacrificed. And you brought there's a sense of fellowshipping with the god as you're eating with the god. I'm going out to eat with Zeus tonight, So Zeus has some fat, and you get to eat a little meat. And so you have the priest getting some meat, you or your family get some meat, there was often meat left over. And so what would happen is this meat would find its way down to the marketplace. And so it could pretty well be assumed, as I understand it, that most of the meat in the common marketplace, which would have been a disgusting place with lots of flies and stuff, let's not picture that. Smelly. I'm sure it was horrible from our point of view. But the typical ancient meat market would have had a lot of meat that had been sacrificed at a pagan temple. This creates a matter of conscience. If you're a Jew and you only believe there's one God, should I eat meat that has been offered to Aphrodite? I think many Jews answered in the negative. Many Jews answered no. Probably there were many Jews that didn't. There were probably many Jews out in the diaspora scattered out there who said, yeah, I'm just going to get the meat anyway. But some, I think, Jews became vegetarians for this reason, because they didn't want to accidentally eat meat. So this is the background for Paul talks about this in Romans 14 and 15 as well. The question is, this is a good old improvisation question. What do we do when I'm buying meat? If it's been offered to another god, should I eat it? What if I don't know? Where does the tie go? I don't know where this meat comes from. Do I not eat it to be safe, or do I eat it because I don't know any better? So some Jews became vegetarians. It reminds me of, should I celebrate Halloween or should I not celebrate Halloween? Should I watch this movie? Should I not watch this movie? Should I read Harry Potter? Should I not read Harry Potter? These are the kinds of issues I think we're getting at here, where the history of something maybe has some badness to it, or the imagery could be taken in a bad way. This is a matter of conscience. And I think it's important for us to realize that we have entered the territory of conscience and of conviction. Let me say conviction. Personal conviction and even group conviction is when a group or an individual says, I'm not going to say that you're wrong to read Harry Potter, but as far as my conscience is concerned, I'm not going to read it. Or I'm not saying that you're wrong to do that thing, but I'm not going to say you're wrong to celebrate Halloween because you're just dressing up, like Superman. But I'm not going to do it. That's the kind of issue that we're getting at here. And Paul basically says, if you don't know where the meat came from, give thanksgiving because it's God's meat anyway. So Paul does not consider the meat to be intrinsically defiled. Some Jews did. But in Romans 14, Paul says very clearly, no meat, nothing is unclean in and of itself. That whether it's unclean or not depends on whether you think it's unclean. So if you think the meat's unclean, it is unclean to you, and you shouldn't eat it. If you think the meat is clean, it's clean to you. Eat it with thanksgiving to God. This is a kind of relativist, let me just be naughty here and say this is a relativist position on this issue, which sometimes I've heard Christians try to say all rights and wrongs are absolutes and relativists are bad. But Paul's a relativist on this issue. Now, he's not a relativist on adultery, he's not a relativist on stealing, but when it comes to this issue, so this is an important truth. There are some issues that Christians are absolutist on, and there are some issues that Christians are relativist on, which means that just saying, oh, that's relativism, doesn't do squat. You're going to have to get into the specific issue and wrestle with that specific issue. You can't just say that, oh, you're being relativist, therefore, you're wrong. Paul's a relativist on this issue. We're going to have to think harder than that. Christians make God look stupid all the time. Drives me nuts. Basically, Paul says, whether or not you should eat the meat depends on whether or not you think the meat is unclean. If you think the meat is unclean, don't eat it. If you think the meat is clean, then give thanks to God because everything belongs to Him anyway. So that's Paul's position on this particular issue. Of course, on Romans, he does say that people can be wrongly convinced. He does believe that there are right or wrong answers on some of these things. And so if you say, no, I think I'm okay with my conscience, but you're lying to yourself. You can lie to yourself, and that's the danger. And so we need to, again, the community of faith is helpful to help us know when we're lying to ourselves and when our conscience is truly clear. These are complex issues. Like I said in the video on 1 Corinthians 7, it requires spiritual improvisation. And so, we like pat answers. We like easy answers. We love the easy answers. We like to make fun of the people who make things complex. Guess what? It's complex. Okay, moving right along. So basically, the Corinthians, there's a group at Corinth, the Apollos party, who think that they're hot stuff, they're intellectuals, they're wise, they know stuff. And Paul's basically saying, anybody who thinks that they're hot stuff isn't. If you think you're smart, you're not. God is smart. God knows you. You may think you know God. Guess what? God knows you. And so we lie to ourselves, we rationalize, we make things up, we try to wiggle out of things, but God knows. God knows us. Okay, so basically, what is Paul's principle? Again, let me try to sum it up. I've started to sum up, and I've given you some of the points. But the point is basically the meat is not the meat is morally neutral. The food itself is morally neutral. The food itself is neither clean nor unclean. The question is your conscience. If your conscience is clear, it's God's meat. Go ahead and eat it with thanksgiving, because He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. It's His beef, or probably goat actually in this case. It's His goat. Give Him thanks and eat it if your conscience is clear. If your conscience is not clear, don't eat it. So don't, that's pretty clear. Now, he does say, as I say, when he gets to chapter 10, he says, don't go to an idol's temple. So don't go and eat it at the temple, because that's a demon house. You don't want to go to demon house. A demon house is not a good place for a Christian to be. Okay, actually, it's here in chapter 8 where he says that. For example, what if someone sees you eating at the temple of an idol? Okay, he talks about it in chapter 10 too. What if someone, here he's talking about the appearance of it. So there's one, if your conscience is clear, eat it with thanksgiving. If your conscience is not clear, don't eat it, stay away. Don't go to a pagan temple, because demons live there. And then this final factor has to do with other people, your influence and your impact on others. This is important for Paul. We don't just act to ourselves. We have to consider the impact of our actions on others. There's all kinds of issues that this comes home on. Some of the issues today with whether we should say, should I say all lives matter, or should I, what if my conscience is clear when I say it? Paul says the impact of my words on others is it's a thing. It's a real thing. My impact on others is a thing. And so if my words or if my actions are going to hurt the spiritual status of someone else. Now, I realize sometimes we're just ticking people off. Like I have a wedding ring. I don't think anybody really cares these days, but there was a time in the past where, having a wedding ring would have made people angry, and they would have gossiped about him. Look, he's got a wedding ring. Oh, he's so prideful. There's a time and place where that would have been the case. Is that hurting them spiritually? No, I mean, they're probably hurting themselves spiritually. So there is a time when you're just ticking people off, and you're not hurting them spiritually. Paul is talking about a situation where my actions actually hurt another person's faith, or hurt another person's spirituality, or put an obstacle in the way of the gospel, or make people not want to become a Christian, that sort of thing, become a bad witness. These are the kinds of things we're, I think, talking about here. When my action hurts the gospel, or when my action causes someone to stumble spiritually, then that's the fourth situation. So if your conscience is clear, eat it with thanksgiving. If your conscience is not clear, don't eat it. Don't go to a pagan temple. And if your action is going to hurt the gospel or someone else spiritually, then don't do it. So he says here very tactfully in the last part of chapter 8, not everybody has this knowledge. Some people are so accustomed to idols that even though they believed on God, even though they believed on the real God, Yahweh, they're going to get in trouble if it's going to mess up their conscience if they were to eat that meat. Now, they quote, here's again, maybe another quote from their letter. Food won't bring us close to God. Yes, that's true. But my liberty should not lead someone else to stumble. This is a missing piece, I think, in the church today. We are so individualistic in our Western world that we think it's all about my conscience with God. Doesn't matter what my actions do to somebody else. It's all about me and God. But Paul says, no. You have to take into account the impact of your actions on others. You are not free to just act according to your conscience without regard to what the impact is on the witness or on other people within the church. We need to take that into account because we love our neighbors ourselves and we love our enemies. And so he suggests that if someone sees you at a pagan temple eating, that's probably going to have a negative effect on that other person's faith. Don't do it. And when you sin against members of your family, of course he's primarily talking about within the church here, you're sinning against Christ. And so if my eating meat is going to cause someone else to stumble, I'm not going to eat meat. I heard a story once of a Wesleyan general official who'd gone to a particular location where they didn't believe in wedding rings, and he was trying to preach a sermon. And it was clear to him, this is interesting, this sounds so strange from our perspective today, but he said as he would move his hands preaching, the eyes of everybody in the congregation actually were following his hand all the way around. And he said he finally came to the conclusion that his ring was interfering with the hearing of the gospel. And so he actually stopped his sermon and he says, is this a problem? Took off his wedding ring, put it in his pocket, and he said there was an audible sigh of relief at that. And so in that particular case, I think he did the right thing. He said to himself, I'm trying to preach the word, and this is a stumbling block to the gospel being preached today, and he took it off. Now, again, these decisions are spiritual improvisation. You can't legislate exactly what God wants you to do in that situation. But it's an example of someone saying, this thing that is neither good nor evil in and of itself is impeding a good work right now. I'm going to take it off. And so if something I do is causing my brother to stumble, now that wasn't causing them to stumble. Nobody was going to lose their faith over him having a wedding ring, but it was impeding the gospel. And so he thought the gospel is more important in this moment of improvisation than me having this ring. And so he took it off. So if food is going to cause someone else to fail, I'll become a vegetarian so that I may not cause them to fail. Let me skip chapter 9 for a second and go to the conclusion of the matter in chapter 10. He says, I don't want you to be unaware that everybody passed under the sea, everybody was baptized. Okay, so there were a bunch of Christians. He's using an analogy. Hebrews will build on this, by the way, in Hebrews 3. So Israel left Egypt, they went through the Red Sea, so they were baptized, as it were, in the cloud of Moses. They ate spiritual food, manna. They had communion, as it were. They were part of the communion fellowship of Israel. This is all a metaphor, as it were, an allegory. And Paul says, let's not be like them. Some of them became idolaters. They became enticed and so Paul, I think this shows that Paul thinks that there's some people at Corinth who say, yeah, I don't believe in that God, but that maybe they haven't completely. I wonder if Paul's wondering, maybe they haven't completely actually given up belief in those other gods. And by the way, we can understand there would have been a lot of immense social pressure to go to these temples. The temples were the cornerstone of public life in the ancient world. And there were like Erastus was the city treasurer. If you're in politics, you need to be seen. You need to see and be seen. And so the fact that Erastus, if Erastus can no longer go to a pagan temple, I'm in Detroit, by the way, at a hotel where construction's going on. If a public person like Erastus can't be seen in public, he's going to run into political trouble. So you can understand there must have been a lot of social pressure, especially for the social elite. There weren't many of them, but there were probably a couple or few social elite at Corinth, and they must have experienced immense social pressure to participate in public life at pagan temples. And so this is not just an idle kind of discussion. And there was also sexual immorality, perhaps associated with the temple. Temple of Aphrodite up on the Acro, Corinth. I'm not actually sure whether it was still functioning at the time of Paul, but some of the sexual immorality that took place would have taken place in relation to pagan temples. And so participation in pagan temples also, I think, connects to sexual immorality, possibly. And so I think Paul wants to very tactfully convince them not to participate in pagan temples. Meat's no big deal. If you have a clear conscience, eat it with thanksgiving. But going to a pagan temple is dangerous. It's bad. Flee the worship of idols, he says in verse 14. Why do I want to eat at the pagan of... Here we are, verse 20. Here it is finally. Why do I want to be partners with demons? You cannot drink the cup of the Lord in communion and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord in communion and the table of demons. You're provoking the Lord to jealousy, and that's not a good thing. And so Paul's basic thing is follow your conscience. If your conscience is clear, eat the meat. If your conscience is not clear, don't eat the meat. Don't go to a pagan temple. And lastly, consider what the impact of your actions is on others. If your actions are going to have a negative spiritual effect on others, then modify your actions. And of course, he gives the general conclusion here at the end of the chapter. He quotes their letter again. All things may be lawful for me. Yes, we're not under the law, but not everything is going to be beneficial. All things may be lawful, okay, but not everything's going to build us up, and we want to do things that build us up. And we don't want to build ourselves up, we want to build up the community. He says, whatever's sold in the meat market, don't ask where it came from. Don't ask, don't tell. Everything's the Lord. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness of it. Eat the meat, enjoy it, give thanks to God. If somebody invites you to a meal, don't ask where the meat came from. Now, if somebody's going to be bothered by it, and that's kind of the way I take this, if someone says, Paul, this has been offered to us to another God, then he says, in order to assuage the conscience of the other person, don't eat it for their sake. This is not your problem, but this is because you love your neighbor. He says, why should my liberty be subject to the judgment of someone else's conscience? It shouldn't when I'm talking about me alone. But when it comes to the faith of others, that's something I have to take into it. And so here we have the general statement. Whatever you eat or drink, whatever you do, do it for the glory of God. And that is, I think, a fundamental ethical principle. So love God, love neighbor. What does it mean to love God? Here's what it means to love God. What it means to love God is that everything we do it consistently with our love of Him. That means we don't do anything that we think would in any way go against our love of God. That's how we live out love of God. We live out love of God by not doing anything that is going to create a divided heart. So there's nothing that we're not doing anything with I'm going to hold back a little bit from God. This could be any issue. There are all kinds of issues where one person would be able to do it, but I would not be able to do it in good conscience because I know I could not do that to the glory of God. Well, chapter 9. I skipped chapter 9. Chapter 9 is where basically Paul uses himself as an example of what it means to live out in his context. What does it mean to live out in his context these principles? And so he points out that he has rights as an apostle. Just like they say, well, I have knowledge. Paul might say, I have rights. He says, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus the Lord? By the way, this is Paul's understanding of an apostle. An apostle is someone to whom the risen Lord appeared, and the risen Lord commissioned to go and be a witness to the resurrection. And so there are no apostles like Paul today, not like this, because Jesus hasn't appeared to any of us like he appeared to Paul and the other apostles. But basically, Paul says, I have rights. I'm an apostle. I should be able to travel with a wife like Peter. Peter had a wife. Or is it Barnabas and I who only have to work for a living? And this was Paul's principle. Paul worked wherever he went. This kept him from unencumbered from the strings of patronage. And he also quotes Deuteronomy 24. Don't muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. You should let the ox eat. It's working for you. And so ministers should be supported materially by those to whom they are ministering. This is an argument for ministers being paid. By the way, Paul's a city boy. The idea that God would care about oxen just doesn't compute with him here. He's making somewhat of an allegorical interpretation of that command. The literal meaning of Deuteronomy 24 is of no interest to Paul whatsoever, apparently. But Paul basically says, I have rights, I've not used them for the betterment of the gospel. Same for you. You may have knowledge, but it's not just about your knowledge, it's about the impact of your knowledge on others as well. And so Paul basically says, I have rights, but I've not made use of those rights, and I don't want to make use of those rights. In fact, he kind of boasts at being able to do basically, you can't control me because I'm not getting material support from you. This was a part of the awkwardness of Paul. He always took his support from other churches, not from the church he was at, so that he might not be entangled with the strings of patronage. Now we get in these last 19 through 23, we get Paul's operating principle that is very helpful, I think. To the Jews I became like a Jew. To those who are under the law I became as one under the law, although I'm not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. Paul has separated himself to some extent from Judaism. Now, by the way, Jew here may mean, he calls himself an Israelite elsewhere. Jew here might mean somebody who is zealous for the law. And Paul was no longer zealous for the law as he was when he was a Pharisee. He's not under the law anymore. So to those who are not under the law, to those who are under the law, I became as one under the law, that I might win those under the law. When keeping the Jewish law helped the gospel spread to Jews, he kept the Jewish law. Now, I think Paul probably kept the Jewish law for the most part anyway. I don't think Paul just completely abandoned keeping the Jewish law. But the principles here is that if changing your lifestyle, or if changing the way you talk, if changing who you are helps people come to Christ, then do it. Don't be stubborn and say, I have a right to talk this way, or I have a right to be this way. Yeah, Paul says in this chapter, it's not about your rights. It's about loving others and seeing them come to Christ. In my own history, I came to this struggle when I was in seminary, because when I grew up, I used to say he. I did not include women in my language. There are preachers today who all their illustrations are he. And they don't even realize that in this day and age, in the 21st century, there are women in the congregation. And that when you say he all the time, you may mean everybody. I'm sure you do. You probably mean everybody when you say he did this, he did that, he in all of your illustrations. You probably mean well. Your intentions are probably well. But I'm telling you that in the 21st century, the women in the audience and men like me, every time I hear a speaker only say he, what I hear is not women, not women, not women. And you may say, well, that's not my intention. I don't care what your intention is. How are people hearing it? You're thinking only about yourself, your narcissistic selfishness. What is the impact on your words on others? What does it hurt for you to say she every once in a while? Give an illustration with a woman, he and she. What does it hurt? Why are you so stubborn? There are versions of the Bible. There are versions of the Bible that stubbornly refuse to include women when we know. When Paul said, brothers, flee sexual immorality, he wasn't giving the women in the congregation a pass. Stop being stubborn. It's not about your right. Well, I have a right to say he every time if I want to. Who cares about your rights? Paul says to the Jews, I became a Jew that I might win the Jews. So obey God and think about other people and not just yourself. To the weak I became weak that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel. If your language is putting an obstacle in the way of the gospel, then stop it. That's the word of the Lord. Now, what did he do to those who are outside the law? He said to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. He fudged on the edges of his Jewish law keeping when he was ministering to Gentiles. This is what he did at Galatians. When he saw that being a purist with regard to keeping the law created division within the body of Christ at Antioch, he fudged on the edges of the law. But he makes it clear, I am under Christ's law. It's not a free-for-all. It's not I can do whatever I want now. And this is the problem he ran into Corinth. They said, see, Paul, I'm not under the law. I'm sleeping with my father's wife. To those who are not under the law, he became as those under the law, but he is still under Christ's law. What is Christ's law? Christ's law is to love your neighbor and to love your enemy. And so that is the Christian ethic. All Christian ethics reduces to the great commandment. Love God, love neighbor. Those two, love God, love neighbor, all God's laws fit within one or another of those headings. Okay, sorry, I'm preaching a little here. Finally, we get to 24 through 27, which ends up, he's basically saying we need to be careful how we run the race. And again, he says, I can be disqualified. This is a sobering thing. Even Paul says, I don't want to be disqualified from this race. Not everybody wins the race. Not everybody who looks like they're a Christian is actually going to make it to the kingdom of God in heaven. Run in such a way that you may win. Athletes are disciplined. They run to win. They don't run aimlessly, but they discipline their body so that they can win the prize. Now, I don't know what theology you come from. If you believe in predestination and election and the perseverance of the saints, that's fine, as long as your theology is that if someone doesn't end up running the race right, they probably were never a Christian in the first place. That's coherent. I understand that. But a person who doesn't finish the race, a person who can be disqualified, the sense here is that it is possible to look like you're a Christian and not make it in the end. Of course, as a Wesleyan Arminian, I would say it's possible to be saved and then not be saved in the end. That's the most natural way, I think, to take Paul's language in places like this. But let's say that you believe in the perseverance of the saints. That's fine. Then you just process this as saying that if you don't end up finishing the race, you were never a Christian in the first place. But however you want to process it, Paul basically says just because you're coming to church, just because you're in the church, doesn't mean you're going to make it in the end. That those who make it to the end, make it to the end, as it were. Those who complete the race make it to the end. And so we need to make sure that we make it to the end, because it does matter according to Paul. Well, this has been 1 Corinthians chapter 8 through 10, coming to you from an undisclosed hotel in Detroit, Michigan.